Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
I'm Alex.
And the topic for this episode is the cerebellum. What is it doing? What's going on down there? And this is special because Alex is with us, and Alex has been on the podcast many times, but this time is different because Alex actually works on the cerebellum. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your research, Alex?
Yeah, so I'm a postdoc at UCL in Angus Silver's lab, and I study how the circuitry of the cerebellar cortex, which is the input layer to the cerebellum, integrates sensory and motor information for associative learning and pattern separation, essentially using theoretical techniques as well as some data analysis.
Cool. And all of those words will make more sense to everyone after this episode when we do a great job explaining what the cerebellum does. So we read a paper called What the Cerebellum Computes. That's from 2003, and the first author is Oyama, and that was in Trends in Neurosciences. And then we also read The Cerebellum and Cognitive Function, 25 Years of Insight from Anatomy and Neuroimaging. And that was a perspective piece in Neuron in 2013 from Randy Buckner. But I think we should start by just describing what the cerebellum is, because if most people picture a brain, they probably picture the big wrinkly bit, which is the cerebrum, which is the Latin word for brain. Further solidifying the fact that that's the brain, which is what a lot of people, even within neuroscience, think about when they think of the brain. But turns out there's another little bit tacked on below that big wrinkly part, which is less wrinkly and more neatly folded, and that's the cerebellum. And that is Latin for little brain. And that's slightly ironic because while it is smaller than the cerebrum, it contains many more neurons. It contains roughly 4 times as many neurons as the cerebrum. So that's about 80 billion in the human cerebellum compared to 20 billion in the human cerebrum. So yeah, but it is the case that it's kind of, I think there's a lot of, any area that's not the cerebrum, there's a sense in neuroscience that it's understudied or underappreciated or not thought of as the brain. And I think that happens with the cerebellum and other subcortical areas and stuff. But as we'll get into, it has a lot of important functions that relate very directly to what's done in the cerebrum. I also want to talk about terminology because I always want to say cortex when I mean the cerebrum, because that's what people say. But as Alex already referred to, the cerebellum has a cortex as well.
So Alex, could you clarify some of these terminological distinctions for us?
Yeah, well, there's the cortex, which is the cerebellar cortex, which is the surface of the cerebellum, which is where information is brought from primary sensory areas, from vestibular regions, but also from cortical regions. So that's both sensory and motor parts of cortex, as well as association parts of cortex, which we'll discuss later. So then this will get very confusing, talking about cortical projections to the cortex of the cerebellum and just cortices everywhere.
Yes, I anticipate it being very confusing. Okay, so this first paper, What the Cerebellum Computes. So the idea here, this paper focuses on motor aspects of the cerebellum, and that is historically what people generally thought the cerebellum was about. As the title of the second paper alludes to, there are also now, beliefs for cognitive functions in the cerebellum, but this first paper is going to give us the kind of traditional view of what the cerebellum does with regards to motor coordination and motor learning and execution of motor skills. And so this paper is trying to put forward a description of what they think the cerebellum does, what's a good kind of computational description of the role of the cerebellum. And we said in our last episode on reinforcement learning that if you wanted to kind of divide the roles of the different parts of the brain up according to what kind of learning they do, the basal ganglia would be for reinforcement learning, so learning from rewards, and the cerebrum would be for unsupervised learning, so just kind of getting the statistics of your environment, and then the cerebellum was listed as being for supervised learning. And we can talk about how that relates to what this paper puts forward, which is the idea that the cerebellum is for feed-forward control. And what does that mean?
Okay, so there's a few different ways you can think about the control scheme. And there's a good example for what kinds of control schemes can be demonstrated is to talk about a thermostat. So with a thermostat, you have a desired temperature, and that's the thing that, as the human, you would set for the thermostat. So the desired temperature might be some temperature in degrees. And if you're the engineer who's designed the thermostat, you might have built it a few different ways. You basically might set it so that a person having set the temperature, the desired temperature of the thermostat will just like kind of go to a certain kind of control setting and stay there. This would be open loop. It would be a thermostat that is not at all responsive to its environment. Maybe it would be like initially tuned based on a guess that the engineer made about how much energy you should burn or how much air conditioning you should turn on to get you to relative temperatures. But it would be kind of ignoring the environment outside. So that would be open loop control, basically.
So it wouldn't be sensing what the actual temperature in the room is.
Yeah. So this is like not a good idea. So it's almost irrelevant for the purpose of the discussion. The simplest thing that you could really do that would be responsive to the environment would be to set up a system that will have feedback, which says, I sense that the room is a current temperature, and I will, if the temperature is too low relative to the desired temperature, I will turn up the thing that creates heat. So this is the control action that the thermostat takes, is to like up the production of heat, and then the temperature will increase. It'll get closer and closer to the desired temperature, and maybe it will overshoot. And if it overshoots, feedback control would say, I now sense the thermostat would say, I now sense the temperature and it's overshot. It's too hot in the room. And so then it reduces the thing, or maybe even turns on an air conditioning unit to reduce the temperature back. And so that this could produce oscillations if the feedback is too slow at time scale. So basically you might go overshoot and then undershoot, and you might keep doing this. But hopefully, if you design the system well, it would converge. And this is the kind of thing that you learn. Like a similar example is like a door hinge that like damps to a closed door, and this is like a common example in like high school and undergraduate textbooks. So standard control theory is like, how do you critically damp things so that you have a system which appropriately converges to a stable desired temperature. So this is sort of the most standard setting. There's another kind of control that is actually like a little bit more sophisticated, you might say, which if the environment is perturbed, if think about it as regulating you around a certain temperature, if the environment is perturbed, you might sort of anticipate what the consequences of that perturbation are going to be before they have a significant effect. So like if someone opens a window, if you had sensor wired your entire house or apartment such that when the window was opened, the thermostat became aware that the window was opened. And now the temperature inside hasn't even changed yet, but the thermostat is able to predict, there's going to be a change due to the window being opened that hasn't yet occurred. And I'm going to anticipate that and change how much heat or cooling I produce to take into consideration the fact that the opening of the window will have an effect if I do nothing. And this is in the control theory basically considered feed-forward control. So instead of feedback control, which reacts to changes in the temperature relative to the desired temperature, feed-forward control can predict the changes in the current temperature relative to the desired temperature and take action sort of proactively. And so this is sort of clearly more complicated than sort of more simple feedback regulation.
Right, and so the way that this is studied in the cerebellum, obviously the cerebellum isn't controlling the temperature of anything. So the type of experiment that's been used for a long time, I think, is this eye blink conditioning. And so what happens there is that you have an animal. It must have been originally studied in rabbits, because I always envision a rabbit when I think about this.
Yes, it was studied in rabbits.
And right, so you play a tone to the rabbit, so some sound, and then some amount of time later, you blow a puff of air into the rabbit's eye. And obviously the rabbit, doesn't like that and doesn't want to get air in its eye, so it blinks reactively to the air puff. But then over time, if the air puff reliably follows the tone, then the rabbit will learn to blink in anticipation of the air puff after it hears the tone. So this is an example of doing some kind of feed-forward control, because this tone tells you that you should prepare for the air puff. You don't actually need to have the air puff happen and respond to it. You can respond in anticipation. And so this is something that is known to be mediated by the cerebellum. The learning of this pairing uses the cerebellum. So that's kind of the setting under which the concept of feed-forward control can be talked about.
And for feed-forward control, the cerebellum is more broadly thought to predict the sensory consequences of active movement, which is essentially by creating a forward model, which is related to the more systems level idea of feed-forward model that's talked about in this paper.
So kind of what this is getting at is that if you want to be able to control, basically, if you think of what would go into feed-forward control, you sort of both need to be able to anticipate the consequences of what's going to happen when stuff happens in your environment, and also know then how to take action to prevent that. So if we break this down, in order to perform effective feed-forward control, to close your eye in response to a tone that you know predicts it, you have to first know that the tone predicts the air puff, and secondly, you need to know that closing your eye is a thing that will prevent the air puff from hitting your eye, basically. And sort of if you put those two together, you have a system capable of performing appropriate feed-forward control in that setting.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I don't feel like was addressed in this paper, that distinction. It was kind of just assumed that these things go together. You're predicting that the puff follows the tone, and so you close your eyes. Like, it wasn't discussed about how you would actually know that that's the right reaction, except for the fact that that's the innate reaction. So it's just about learning when you should do the innate reaction based on when you hear the tone and knowing the distance in time between the tone and the air puff. But we can talk about the cytoarchitecture of the cerebellum, because one of the major features of the cerebellum is that it does have this very kind of clean, repeating pattern of the way different cell types interact and connect with each other. And I've seen the diagram like 8 million times, and I never internalize it. Like, I'll never be able to memorize the architecture of the cerebellum. But I just read this paper, so I can talk about it now.
Yeah, so the input comes into the cerebellar cortex through the mossy fibers, which is carrying information from cortical regions through the pontine nucleus, and also from like other subcortical regions. So those inputs are conveyed. Sensory and motor information is then integrated within the cerebellar cortex onto the granule cells, which are the neurons that are like the majority of neurons in your brain, even though they're really, really tall, and they're only on the cortex or the surface of the cerebellum. They have these really short, really stubby dendrites that receive these afferent mossy fibers. But one of the important things is that there's a ton, because there's this huge expansion going from the mossy fibers to the granule cells. Maybe we'll talk about that later, the ideas for what that's for. The information in the granule cells is then conveyed through these ascending axons, which go up into the molecular layer to the top and bifurcate, forming these parallel fibers, which then project onto Purkinje cells. So basically, there's like 3 kinds of fibers. There's the climbing fibers, which are thought to be conveying errors from the inferior olive, which then like kind of wind around the Purkinje cells. There are the mossy fibers, which carry information to the cerebellar cortex, and then there are the parallel fibers, which are like the next stage of the processing from the mossy fibers to the Purkinje cells.
Yeah, and this is like very like cool to look at. I think the way that in the cortex, the real cortex, the one in the cerebrum.
So neocortical centric, the real cortex.
Yes, exactly. I'm continuing with that stereotype. No, things are like there's layers and stuff, and there's subdivisions, but I think the architecture in the cerebellum has like drawn people to it. You know, scientists who see this and think, oh, there's like such a clear structure here. There must be some like really nice function happening. So the mossy fibers would carry information about the tone in the eye blink conditioning scenario, and the climbing fibers would carry information about the fact that there was a blinking in response to air puff? Or is it about the air puff
It would be
itself?
about the puff. It would be like the error, the sensory error, which is the puff because it's not expected.
Okay, yeah. And so then those that information has to be combined in the cerebellum in order for you to learn an association between the two. And as Alex said, there's these granule cells with the parallel fibers, and then those connect to Purkinje cells, which go to the output of the cerebellum that is presumably responsible for triggering the blink at the right time once this is learned.
So I think it's somewhat hard to go over in detail this without reference to a picture, because it is like it's a fairly specific architecture. But the rough idea at least an abstract level is that you're doing some sort of error-based learning, which is basically going to be like a supervised learning algorithm.
It's basically a perceptron learning rule is the classic way to think about it.
Yeah. So there's you had a expectation of what was supposed to happen. You receive an error, and you receive this error coupled with the inputs themselves, and you're able to sort of learn what you should expect to follow the inputs. So in that case, right, you should expect when you hear a tone that at a certain temporal delay there will be a puff, and based on receiving the errors in your prediction, the fact that early on you don't predict the puff but later you do, you basically end up learning the association between inputs in a certain setting and the consequences, or as Alex said, the sensory consequences of those inputs. So this is how the sort of supervised learning of predictions takes place in this circuit.
Can we say where the learning actually happens in this circuit? Like between which cell types?
Yeah, so there's plasticity throughout, but the associative supervised learning happens at the parallel fiber, which is the granule cell axon, to the Purkinje cell synapse.
Right. And so in the eye blink and in other kind of scenarios where associations are learned, the timing is really important. So you can have the tone, and then you can have the puff of air like really quickly after the tone, or there can be a delay. And to blink in a way that will actually help you, you need to like have learned the delay so you know the right time to blink. So apparently the animals can only learn delays that are in between 100 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds. So any fixed delay within that range is learnable. But if the air puff follows the tone too quickly, then they can't learn that if it's less than 100 milliseconds. And if it's too long, then they can't learn that delay either. And so this paper kind of alludes to or tries to speak to why that timescale is what happens. And I don't really understand their explanation. It was something about for the 100 millisecond boundary, like not being able to do anything below that. It seemed like they were trying to say that like by the time for the relative rates that information gets into the cerebellum, if you have the tone less than 100 milliseconds before the puff in the cerebellum, it looks like the tone came after the puff or something. It wasn't very clear to me. But I think that was the explanation that they put forth based on like the timing for things to get into the cerebellum. And then they just said like, and then, you can't have infinite delay, so there's got to be a boundary on the other side. And they didn't try to say why it would be 500 milliseconds on the other side. But the way that the timing is learned, I think they refer to it as, like an open problem. Like it's not exactly clear how you can get the right timing. But it seems like it's due to the diversity of the granule cells and the fact that there's so many granule cells that they can have different response properties. And so you can kind of learn to pick out the right granule cells with the right timing to give you the action at the right time after the tone.
Yeah, there's also, so this is a big question, how this temporal heterogeneity in granule cells occurs mechanistically. So when I described the cerebellar cortex, I kind of not glossed over, I completely ignored the inhibitory feed-forward and feedback motif, which is the Golgi cells, and they're gap junction coupled to each other. And
which means?
Electrically coupled to each other, which means that so the naive way of thinking about that is that it's like one big Golgi cell because they're all kind of like connected into a big one. But actually, previous work in my lab showed that you could have transient desynchronization in the Golgi cells upon mossy fiber activation. So what that means potentially for the temporal profiles of granule cells is that desynchronization could cause some temporal dispersion in the response properties of granule cells. So this is why I'm bringing up Golgi cells as a potential mechanism. Another possibility from David De Gregorio's lab is the synaptic dynamics has been shown to be temporally diverse in granule cells as well. So even though it's a very simple kind of circuit, there are many synaptic and circuit level mechanisms that can cause this heterogeneity without even requiring much diversity within the granule cells themselves.
But so one thing that, like, just to clarify, I mean, I think the notion that these granule cells essentially consist of a bunch of temporally varying responses that can be used to learn associations with certain temporal delays is like part of a more general kind of theoretical principle, right? It's this sort of expansion of...
It's like this adaptive filter idea from Fujita in the 80s was the original, where this came from originally.
You're saying in the cerebellum?
Yeah, in the cerebellum specifically.
Yeah, so I was thinking just even slightly more broadly, like at like a slightly more functional level. Like, basically, it is a common circumstance to find yourself in a kind of machine learning setting to like have an expansion basis. No? Okay.
Oh, you mean like a temporal basis?
Well, so in this case, having diversity in the granule cell population gives you something that you can latch onto for learning.
Yeah.
Right? So you want to have an enormous diversity of the granule cells' response properties.
Yeah.
Just functionally, right? I mean, you were explaining a bit mechanistically how it's arising, but like...
But it almost like doesn't matter, yeah.
No, it matters, right? I mean, like
how the mechanistically you're just saying that it's beneficial, yeah.
So functionally, it is useful for there to be diversity of granule cell properties so that you can latch onto them for the purposes of learning at different delays, right? If there's no granule cell that has response delays of more than 400 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds, then you're not going to be able to learn associations that reflect delays of longer than that time scale.
Which I think is probably what's going on with this, the maximum at which this side-link conditioning can be learned.
I think this is the theory, but the point is I mean this happens in other parts of the brain, and this is kind of like at least like a reasonably well understood mechanism from a theoretical standpoint.
Yeah.
Right. Is that like if you want to have learning take place, you need to have like kind of a set of response profiles, roughly speaking, that can capture that diversity. And if like the fundamental limits of the circuit, for whatever reason, just in terms of the diversity of naturally occurring cells, does not include something that you want to learn, then it may be more difficult. So in this case, this is about temporal profiles. Like all the granule cells have randomly generated, let's say, due to particular mechanistic details, have randomly generated diversity of temporal response profiles. But those temporal response profiles exist within a certain range. And so that's what the system is capable of learning delays in response to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they said that if you lesion the cerebellum, then you only have a single fixed delay. Like they can learn to blink, but it won't be at a time related to the delay between the tone and the air puff. It'll just be at a fixed delay. But yeah, I think this idea of having these different, like having the diversity so that you can draw from it to learn comes up a lot in another system that's studied for its cerebellum-like properties, the electric fish system. So this is a fish that uses electrical signals that it sends out in the water as like a radar to sense its surroundings and find prey and stuff. And it's complicated because it has this system where when it sends a signal out, it kind of disrupts its own sensory system to be able to sense the electric signals coming back. And so it needs to know when it sent out this like pulse of electricity so that it can cancel it out when it's kind of reading back the electricity on its skin. And so it needs to learn this like somewhat complicated shape that comes on its skin as a result of its own sending out of the pulse. And so to do that, it would need this like, this like alphabet of granule cell responses that it can kind of pull together in different combinations to get the right shape. So I think that's where a lot of the theory about that diversity is developed as well.
Recently, from Michael Mock's group as well, they had an eLife paper where they did eye blink conditioning in rabbits, but they instead of just training the rabbit to blink at a certain delay after the tone. They also train them to blink at the same delay after the first blink, and then keep blinking like that. So it's kind of interesting. You can like stretch it out in a way, but only using the previous blink as an extra cue.
Oh yeah, that is interesting. I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be able to work.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. It's thought, so there have been discovered these feedback projections. I mean, cerebellar cortex is usually thought of, and the cerebellum in general, as a very feed-forward system at the circuit level, not at the systems level that we were describing earlier.
Yeah, these terms are overloaded, feedback and feed-forward.
So it's thought that these feedback from deeper areas in the cerebellum to the cerebellar cortex are responsible for this.
So wait, am I right in saying that it's not clear how you generally know the right action to take, even if you can learn to predict the sensory consequences? The actual generating of an action is not discussed?
Well, even before it just being not discussed, yes. I mean, this was the distinction we were trying to get at earlier, that like, if you want to do system level sort of feed forward control, where you sort of predict the consequences of changes or perturbations in the environment on what's going on for you, and then you want to be able to take action to prevent those consequences from occurring, you have to both be able to predict the consequences that will occur and also know how to change it. So yes, kind of literally what has been being discussed so far in terms of what the cerebellar architecture is related to are being able to competently predict the sensory consequences of stuff that happens in the environment. So the tone happens, and then you can anticipate the air puff, but knowing that closing your eyes will prevent you from suffering the sort of nuisance of experiencing the air puff, that's arguably a separate process. It requires knowing what actions to take at the behavioral level to prevent certain sensory experiences. And as far as I understand, Alex can correct us if this is incorrect, that's not like primarily what's studied in terms of current experimental paradigms for cerebellum.
Yeah, that's right. I think that could be even cortical. I think motor cortex.
Yeah, so I guess for the purposes of this conversation, we're not totally sure where that's happening, and we're focusing mostly on the cerebellum as modeling, let's say, the sensory consequences of stuff that happens.
Yeah.
All right. Then perhaps it's time to switch over to other potential roles of the cerebellum, non-motor roles. So it is the case that for most of the history of studying the cerebellum, the motor aspects and its role in motor control were the primary thing that we're focused on. And a lot of that association between the cerebellum and motor control came because when you have a lesion to the cerebellum, like if people have an injury that disrupts it, they have motor problems. That's like a big side effect of those kinds of injuries. And so that's a very reasonable way to conclude that that is the role of that brain area.
But I think because the cerebellum also, like I was saying, it doesn't generate movement, but it kind of responds to unexpected perturbations that are related to movement, at least the motor part of it. And so the idea of how it could be related to cognitive processing would be kind of similar, where it's not generating cognitive processes, but it would be kind of modulating them in responses to some kind of perturbations, although that's not really clear what that means in this context. But I guess what I'm saying is that it's a very potentially subtle effect that you wouldn't be able to see as obviously as you can see somebody who has ataxia, where they can't have make a smooth movement, for example.
Yeah, and I assume, well, so one of the things is part of how this was learned was they did lesion experiments in animals, and so then you're definitely not really going to find a cognitive deficit if you don't look for it. And then, yeah, in the people who have the injuries, I could see how, like, that motor effect, like, even if you had some sort of cognitive weirdness after you had a cerebellum injury, like, you just had some brain injury. So, and like you're adjusting to like a new body that doesn't move the way you want it to. Like, I could see how the cognitive things could be overlooked in human studies because there's just so much going on if you've had a cerebellum injury.
I'm also imagining like a kind of arrogant 1970s doctor or whatever looking at patients that have had cerebellar injuries, probably being somewhat condescending and not very closely assessing changes in cognition between before and after they suffered their injury. And like the motor deficits are going to be sort of apparent upon a 45-minute inspection of a person. but like the subtle cognitive effects of like this
Even
person.
like 45 seconds, I think.
No, exactly. Yeah, but like the sort of more detailed, like this person seems to have issues planning over certain horizons or something like this, or things that like might be subtle cognitive effects that like impair them clearly, but would be subtle and hard to diagnose because they still have neocortex, cerebral cortex functioning that can sort of compensate for some of the cognitive deficits, or at least appear to compensate for some of the cognitive deficits. I think it's very easy to imagine that these things, easy to see in the historical literature of scientific literature that these things were overlooked. So basically this paper, in addition to talking about that, also talks about some of the biological reasons why these were overlooked. So one thing that was particularly striking to me in this paper was the discussion of why anatomical connections between cerebral cortex and the cerebellum were particularly difficult to discover, which I did not know about.
Yeah, so they're not. It's not direct projections. So like I said previously, cortical inputs come in through the pontine nucleus, and then projections back go through the thalamus. So because there's not a direct projection with a single synapse, you can't use traditional tracing techniques in order to see that these regions are connected.
Yeah, so usually people would like inject a cell with some kind of dye or something like that and in one brain area, and then see where that dye shows up in other brain areas to be like, oh yeah, that neuron, sends its projections to this other place. But if there's an intermediate area in between, then you'll see it show up in that intermediate area, but you won't know where that then goes on to. So those kind of older tracing methods couldn't tell you if there was, like another neuron in between the connection that you're interested in. And so it did take the more advanced tracing techniques that are able to actually cross the synapse. So you can put a tracer into one neuron. When it reaches a synapse, it'll jump over it and go into another neuron, and then you can see where that neuron goes on to. And so that will allow you to see the kind of second order projections and be able to tell that there is an indirect pathway that connects the neocortex to the cerebellum.
On the more functional side, I think another reason is that it's been historically difficult to get, for example, population recordings in the cerebellum, especially with granule cells, because they're very small and very densely packed. You can't use traditional electrode techniques, and a lot of the areas that are connected to more association cortex tend to be like really off on the side. So in order to use optogenetics or to record from these areas, the animal, like in a head fixed setup, would have to be at such a weird angle that it's just not really possible to test.
Right. So so in the cerebellum there are there's like a somatotopy, which is like a map of the body. Different cells that relate to different parts of the body are kind of arranged in a way that's similar to the way the body is arranged. And they have two of those maps. I don't know why there's two. Like there's two different maps of the body in the cerebellum. And then there's an area in between them that has these connections that we now know has these connections to the association areas of neocortex, which association areas are like areas that combine different information. Like it's not the primary visual or primary auditory cortex. It's like later areas where that information goes on to be processed, and includes like prefrontal cortex and stuff, which is like executive function and whatever, but like just the more complicated brain areas, I guess. So there's those areas project to this place in the middle. So it's interesting that it is like the anatomy of it that made it hard to know what was going on.
But so now, if I'm understanding correctly, the sort of emerging consensus that I think has been around for a while now would basically be that like all of the sort of cerebral cortex has specific parts of the cerebellum that it projects to. So there's like essentially like the cerebellum is kind of like a little second brain that is kind of pairwise connected to different parts of
like two little second.
There's double. Okay, but specifically like all of the cerebral cortex has like a sort of analog region in the cerebellum.
No, but not primary visual or primary auditory cortex.
Okay.
But most of them. Yeah.
Those pure sensory areas don't actually seem to have mapping, or we just haven't found it yet. I guess you can't say that it's not possible, given the fact that all of this stuff we're saying now was developed over the past 25 years.
Okay, so but at least the statement is that many non-primary sensory regions in the standard cerebellum, in the standard cerebral cortex, have sort of like paired regions in the cerebellum that they connect to. And so, like at a very coarse level, the sort of the hypothesis would be something along the lines of analogizing from the understanding of how motor and sensory motor processing works in the cerebellum. Each neocortical region is coupled to a part of the cerebellum where it gets to do this kind of error-based learning specific to what that neocortical region is responsible for. So like motor and sensory cortex are doing these sort of predictive models that we talked about before, but you would, again, hypothesize, and we discussed this a little bit earlier, alluded to this a little bit earlier, that higher brain regions or brain regions related to planning or learned associations that are more complex, that are not just body-centric, are also doing something like this.
Yeah, I think because the regularity of the cerebellar circuitry compared to, for example, neocortex or other areas, there's been this idea that whatever the cerebellar circuitry is doing, it does the same thing but with different inputs. So predicting in the sensory motor case, predicting the sensory consequences of movement. In the more associative cortex case, predicting higher cognitive relationships, although it's really not clear what that would mean.
Yeah, they tried to describe, like there's some quotes of people trying to describe the kind of errors you would expect for the cognitive, like if you had a cerebellum lesion, what kind of cognitive errors would it be? And one of them was like mismatch between reality and perceived reality, and erratic attempts to correct the errors of thought or behavior, a dysmetria of thought. And I was just like, okay, I don't know that helps me understand.
Yeah.
No, but I think these are very telling. Right? If you assume, I also find it a little bit unclear. Like I don't have a concrete sense of what that means. But I guess the sense is that the same way that like you predict this is what's going to happen next at a sort of sensory level, like when you hear the tone, you know an air puff's going to happen. You could imagine this happens like at the cognitive level that would be involved maybe in sort of planning behaviors or something like this. Like I'm walking around the world and I know that subways, if I walk into a subway station, a train might arrive at some number of minutes later or something like this. And then I can get on the train and it will take me to where I want to go. And what you're doing is you're sort of, what's required in that reasoning process is the ability to predict temporal associations between events that happen that are sort of abstract events. They're not like immediate events. And I don't know if this is an example of what would happen, but this at least like is a kind of, to me, seems like a kind of candidate thing, unless we know this happens somewhere else in the brain.
I think that's such a complex thing that it probably involves areas all over the brain. It seems like the sense that I got was that it was kind of like imagery maybe, or imagination. They didn't say that word, but they were talking about skillful execution of mental acts, imagining scenes and stuff like that. So I don't really know if this would be on like a really experiential level, like, oh, I try to envision, walking down a hallway and I can't, or like envision, because I know like that's related to hippocampus, people say, partly because it's memory related. But yeah, so I don't know the exact types of deficits that you'd really be able to measure for the kind of descriptions that they're giving.
Do you know the work of Jeremy Schmoman?
Yeah, he was mentioned in this, but I hadn't heard of him before.
Yeah, so he's where is he? Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He's really been a proponent of the idea of the cerebellum as a cognitive area. And he has studied patients with cerebellar lesions or damage to the cerebellum, and has identified what he calls cerebellar cognitive affective disorder, also called Schmoman's disorder sometimes. So there's some really interesting papers where he describes some of the cognitive deficits. I'll just give you an example of one and then see what you guys think. So he basically gave these ambiguous sentences to patients with cerebellar lesions that had this disorder, and asked them to say two potential meanings of this ambiguous sentence. So here, I'm going to do this test on you guys to see if you have this disorder.
Sounds fun.
Right then and there, the man drew a gun. So give me 2 potential meanings for this.
Like a guy took out an actual gun, or a guy drew a picture of a gun?
Yeah, that seems pretty clear. And in this example that he gives, the first meaning that the patient said is, he is trying to rob me. And the second meaning is, he will shoot someone else. Like, there's a whole list of examples. I mean, it's quite anecdotal because it's also...
Yeah, I feel like I can relate to the cerebellar damaged patient.
No, I have to actually be honest that some of these were difficult for me, so I wanted to see if you guys could do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably slightly too literal minded, and so the idea of like drawing a picture of a gun or something like this is that the right answer? You're supposed to draw a picture of a gun? Is the other one?
I think you should. I think I should study your brain.
Yeah,
I should study your cerebellum. But yeah, it's but this is kind of what I was trying to say earlier, is that it's just so difficult to kind of assess, even in the case when you're looking at motor control. It can be very difficult to kind of map what the cerebellum is doing. And so looking at these like very ambiguous cognitive ideas is really difficult. And this is really like a lot of work dedicated to this already by Schmoman's group.
But so in this case, yeah, do you have a sense of concretely how the notion of being able to sort of predict or interpret things in multiple ways relates to maybe the sort of functional circuit level predictive capabilities we were talking about in the cerebellum?
I don't know. Maybe if you think about trying to predict from like different ideas within the sentence, like, I don't know. I feel like I'm just bullshitting. Honestly, I find it very difficult to...
Okay. So it is not totally clear how to relate.
No, and I kind of gave that example because I think it's kind of interesting.
But I
don't see how it's like very related to the sensory prediction that is... Yeah.
Thought in the motor and sensory cortical relationships. This seems slightly more abstract in a way that I can't relate
It's much
concretely
more
to it.
abstract, yeah. And I've also... Like, there are also ideas... I was reading another review on this previously that was saying, for example, I think the idea of a mother's smile is unlikely to be intrinsically rewarding to an infant. So they have to make predictions about the smile being related to like positive, like touch, positive valence, things like touch or food. Again, like this is all very wish-washy, kind of vague.
I guess the other thing that is striking to me, both in the example that I tried to sort of contrive with like the subway or whatever, and these other examples, is that the sort of tight coupling of temporal timescales doesn't seem present, right? Like, when you're talking about the sensory motor stuff, we were saying it's 100 to 500 milliseconds. And so is it the case that in these sort of higher cognitive function settings, the delays, like the sort of scaling of the delays is somehow different? Like...
Yeah, because it is the case. Obviously, the machinery of the neurons doesn't change just because it gets input from association areas rather than motor. But maybe, like in a dream, you can feel like it was an hour in a minute. So maybe like the timescale of a mental events is on the order of a couple hundred milliseconds, even if it's in real life, 20 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, so you can imagine at least that the granule cells, which maybe originally adapted this kind of functionality for motor behavior or something like this, were sort of co-opted, and you rescale this, like, so 100 milliseconds when an association area is using its cerebellar coupled circuit. The 100 milliseconds means something temporally different. It means this might happen an hour later or something like that. I mean, again, I'm making this up, but it seemed like it's implausible that cognitive associations can only be made on the order of 100 to 500 milliseconds.
No, but I think the idea would be that the cerebellum's only responsible for I mean, also, like, motor, dependencies are not always on the order of 500 milliseconds, but the cerebellum isn't responsible for those. It's really like responsible for smoothing trajectories, right? And so maybe also smoothing or trajectories of thought in some like very abstract sense over short time scales, right? Because it's not generating that. So if it's on a very long time scale, it would have to generate kind of a new execution for the. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder for me to see like in the motor case, like air puff related stuff, right? We know it's short time scale. And yes, the movements of your body, right, and the sensory consequences of things, like the sort of intrinsic time scale of those things are hundreds of milliseconds. And even if you were to chain them together to get to small number of seconds, it's like at least this is like a plausible time scale for the movements and sensory consequences of bodily related things. But if we believe that like more abstract planning, like whether a person is going to rob a bank or draw a picture of a gun or something like this, is it all related, right? Those happen on the order of minutes, maybe hours.
No, okay, whether a person's going to rob a store with a gun, yeah, but I mean, when you're listening to someone say a sentence, the way that you're going to respond to that sentence is going to be fast in order to give, like communicate through your body language even with the person you're talking to, and is going to be very different depending on whether it's
okay. No, this is legitimate. And so your point is like in the context of language, it definitely is compressed. And I guess this
absolutely.
This is roughly what I was maybe inarticulately
and emotional communication as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to get at this by saying that like maybe there's a sort of rescaling of timescales in the sense like if something happens on the order of hours, when you reimagine it happening, it happens in a sort of compressed fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I'm saying about the dream.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, all this is to say that like even if the associations have to do with things that happen more abstractly, right? The infrastructure deals on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, and so it has to sort of compress or rescale the associations that might in fact, like in the real world, take place on a longer time scale into these sort of shorter temporal computations.
Well, there is I'm confused about the role of language, because it does seem like language does like let you quickly think about or communicate about things that would take a long time to actually do. And the original way in fMRI that the role of the cerebellum in cognitive things was discovered was that they were having people do this task where they see nouns like dog or cake or something like that, and for the first task they just had to say the words that they saw, and then like the task got progressively more complex, and one of the more complex ones was like you see the noun and then say a verb that would be associated with it. So if you saw the word cake, you would say eat. And in that task, they saw the cerebellum become active, which some people thought maybe was also an indication that even for the cognitive task, it's still motor related because it's like a action verb that people were saying. But it seems like that didn't hold up in other tests. It doesn't have to be like a motor act that you're talking about for the cerebellum to be involved. But then if there is something special about language for this, then it doesn't explain how other animals that don't have language that we have still have the cerebellum involved in cognitive tasks.
I mean, I always feel like this view is slightly too narrow, and that language is more just correlated with having the notions in some sort of internal representation, right? Like, I doubt that the cerebellum is forming an association between the word, like the spoken word or imagined word cake, and the other word eat. It's presumably the concepts of eating and cake, like the abstract concepts, the sort of sensory evocations of those words that are related in some specific way. And the language is sort of the signifier of those things that you are sort of, sort of mentally re-experiencing or have memories associated with. So there's this network of associations, of course, for cake and for eating. And presumably, I mean, it seems much more likely to me that the cerebellum is forming associations between the concepts rather than the words that signify those concepts.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
In which case, then there's like, I guess no. I mean, if that's true, right, then there's not really a confusion, right? It's like the cerebellum forms associations between
abstract inputs.
Between abstract inputs
that can be sensory motor.
Yeah.
Concepts.
Or these abstract concepts.
Emotions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we cracked it.
I think we just have understood what people who are in the field hopefully appreciate. I don't know.
On the other side, just going back to the idea of using lesion experiments or trying to better understand the cognitive role, maybe the non-motor role of the cerebellum, the cerebellar damage at infancy has also been very strongly associated with autism spectrum disorder, which is very well reviewed in 2014 review by Sam Wang. So in this paper, they're discussing a number of different factors that increase your risk for autism. The highest one is genetic, which is having an identical twin who's autistic, and so that increases your risk of autism by up to 50 times. But the highest non-genetic or non-hereditary cause was cerebellar injury at birth, which increases it by a factor of 36, which is on the order of or this very similar to how much smoking increases your risk of lung cancer.
So that's pretty convincing. So at the end of this review about the cognitive roles, the author kind of brings up the fact that it still is the case that even clinically today, the cognitive side of cerebellar damage isn't, highlighted so much, and kind of like toys with the notion that, maybe, these inputs are there and these regions of the cerebellum are there that respond to more abstract things, but like maybe it doesn't really matter and it doesn't really mean anything because it could just be that evolution kind of grew the brain and grew these brain areas, and there's this mapping between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and that just kind of went along with the general evolution, and that they're kind of not selected for in any particular way. They're just kind of a consequence of the general selection for a larger brain.
This was such a bummer. After the review was so exciting, especially as a cerebellar person, and then all of a sudden at the end he's like, but maybe it's just a byproduct of like developmental biology and evolution.
I felt like it was also, I felt like it was almost a bit of a straw man. I mean, I felt like it was like the author was essentially trying to put forth like a hypothetical counter view that probably, almost certainly they themselves do not believe. And
considering that they took the time to write this review.
Exactly. And it felt like a bit of a weak point. I'm not even sure it's worth discussing it so much. Like, basically they're just saying, but maybe there's no selective pressure on a smaller brain, so there's just a bigger cerebellum that isn't really used. But we know there's tremendous selective pressure for there to be a smaller brain.
Just metabolically.
Yeah, so like the brain costs a lot of energy, and fitting a bigger head through a birthing canal is there's costly for humans.
There are so many granule cells. That would be like a really large.
Yeah, it just
energetic waste.
It's a very weak straw man.
And it's also worth saying that the cerebellum is very old. So there's been a lot of time for it to, if it wasn't necessary for the more associative regions, for that part to kind of die off.
Yeah. And it was interesting to me that one of the early things that made people think about the cerebellum as cognitive was just this kind of comparative anatomy where they showed that the this area of the cerebellum grew in the same way that prefrontal cortex did in different primates. So like as prefrontal cortex grew in the cerebrum, this corresponding area grew in the cerebellum. So that kind of like evolutionary mechanism was actually kind of what got this whole field of looking at the cognitive side of cerebellum started in like the late 70s or 80s or whatever. It's also the case that in birds, so their system is a little different. They have that normal like the neocortex goes to the cerebellum through the pons. They have that route, but they also have another route that it goes, the neocortex goes to the cerebellum through the medial spiriform nuclei. And so they don't have, the pons route seems to have not like gotten enlarged in birds, but this other route is like enlarged in certain birds. And so the authors of the paper that talk about this, which I'll link to, kind of, I think, put that forth as a notion of like, no, this was a good idea to like have the cerebellum involved in this stuff, and it was such a good idea that birds found a different way to do it than humans do.
Yeah, the evolutionary lineages kind of converged slightly in the sense that they both have strong connections between cerebellum and the neocortex, but the exact routes by which those connections were forged are different in the different evolutionary lineages.
Also, I just didn't know that the cerebellum represents and controls the ipsilateral side of the body. So in, again, my neocortex-focused life, in the neocortex, usually, like the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, it switches. I didn't realize that the switch happened before the cerebellum.
Yeah, in the pons, yeah.
Yeah, fun fact.
So do we agree that the cerebellum's cognitive then?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of what actually prompted this topic was I've had an interest in understanding the extent to which the cerebellum functions for sort of cognitive roles. And I saw the article about the sort of roughly convergent evolution or slightly different evolutionary trajectory that the sort of bird lineages took. And it prompted me to discuss with Grace the sort of options or what is known about this. I'm relatively convinced. I mean, it seems like this isn't really a controversial claim anymore. And it's not something that is taught like in the sort of standard curriculum, but it seems like there's been a lot of research sort of pushing this theme for the last few decades. So it doesn't even feel really controversial or anything. I mean, just to be clear, right, saying that there's a cognitive role.
No, but I think it's really even been emerging in the past few years that I have noticed since I started my postdoc working in the cerebellum and learning about these potential cognitive effects until now. I feel like it's really started to emerge as stronger and stronger evidence for it.
Yeah, and so I mean, it feels like it's not a widely publicized enough thing that is kind of well understood about the brain, almost.
It seems clear that it was lagging because of methodology, not just because of people's like assumption that we know what it's for motor and that's it, but also like the tracer thing being an issue. This review talks about like when fMRI came around, that was like a big deal because I thought it made it seem like people were just imaging the whole brain because you could with fMRI, and that's when they noticed that cerebellum was responding to things. They weren't actively trying to look at cerebellum. So like that technique, the way it's set up, seemed to be related to this research.
Yeah, that's right. And also I think improvements in like microscopy have made it possible to record from populations of the cerebellum, and there have been some recent studies showing evidence like decision-making evidence, accumulation in cerebellar granule cells, as well as reward prediction signals. So just evidence that these signals that are non-sensory motor are coming into the cerebellum as well, and potentially being used somehow.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess, as you're saying, we definitely shouldn't underrate that some of the technological things are simply just recording from it. So cerebellum is both smaller, kind of more difficult to locate in behavioral, like in preparations of animals where they would still be able to perform behavior, and the neurons are, especially the granule cells, are quite small and challenging to record from. So imaging techniques specifically, rather than electrophysiology, have been sort of important in recent years for enabling this.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm actually going to counter the typical neocortical centrism by saying that I think part of the reason that people are so excited about the neocortex is it's also just really easy to record from.
Yeah.
And I think the next couple decades are going to be really exciting for subcortical regions, especially now that, for example, with neuropixels, it's going to be possible to record from these very deep, I'm not even talking about cerebellum now, but to other deep areas like the pons or other subcortical regions. And we'll start to get a much better understanding, like areas that you could usually only do in slice, that now we can study in awake behaving animals.
So speaking about this slightly more broadly, right, like the cortex is on the surface of the brain, and so it's the easiest to access both electrophysiology and in terms of imaging. And in rodents, the hippocampus is also like at least relatively close to the surface. I mean, like it's not so close to the surface, but it's above all of these other deeper brain structures. So the fact that in rodent hippocampus it can be studied as well is also due to its compared to these other regions, it's still much more accessible. And so in some cases, that's what has enabled or sort of made those research topics burgeon sooner.
It just seems so silly that these practical reasons are like preventing, good, proper science. As though like good, proper science has ever happened. Do we have any final thoughts, feelings about cerebellum, motor aspects, non-motor aspects?
I have one final thought / a plug, that one of the ideas about the cerebellum that we didn't really address is Marr-Albus theory, which is the idea of this big expansion going from the mossy fiber inputs to much larger population of granule cells, as we've said numerous times. They're the most abundant neuron in the vertebrate brain. And the basic idea is that this elevates it into a higher dimensional space, which allows separation of patterns to be facilitated. And I'm currently writing a review on it that hopefully will come out someday. If you guys are interested, you could see it. But that may be a topic for another long discussion.
Ooh, nice. All right. Thank you, Alex, for sharing your expertise on this topic. It was very helpful. Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.